What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Kaliningrad, a speck of land on the map, tightly wedged between Poland and Lithuania. But for decades, it's been one of the Kremlin's loudest cards up their sleeves. A place Moscow has paraded like a gangster's gun tucked under a jacket, always ready to flash it, never quite pulling the trigger. Nuclear missiles in range on every European capital, the Baltic Fleet anchored in an ice-free port, the infamous Suwalki Gap hanging like a noose over NATO. For years, that was enough to make the West sweat and hesitate. But here's the twist. The very fortress Russia used to intimidate Europe is now turning into a prison for Moscow itself. Instead of being a launch pad of power, Kaliningrad is becoming a liability. Separatists are whispering louder than ever. NATO has expanded right past Russia's comfort zone, and Putin's army is still bleeding out in Ukraine with little to spare. The empire's jewel on the Baltic is sleeping, and its place, embarrassment, vulnerability, and maybe even independence. Could it actually happen? Let's try to answer these questions in today's video. For years, Kaliningrad was Russia's top bargaining chip, the place Western analysts described as Fortress Kaliningrad. The Kremlin loved that name, obviously, because it sounded medieval, strong, and terrifying. In 2022, when Putin's grand three-day war collapsed into humiliating retreat, the Kremlin reached for this fortress like a lifeline. While Russian troops were stumbling out of Kiev and trying to run as fast as they could, and then losing even ground in Kharkiv and then Kherson later, Kaliningrad suddenly became the stage for a nuclear theater show. Moscow ran drills simulating nuclear strikes across Europe, reminding NATO that every single capital from Berlin to Paris was just minutes away from obliteration. Putin added his usual mob boss type of warning: lightning-fast retaliation, if the West ever dared to interfere. Fast forward to these days, well, obviously, as we guys know, not a single Putin's threat ever came to life. But here's the dirty secret. This was not about frightening generals in Washington or Brussels, no. The nuclear saber rattling was designed to terrify the civilians, to flood European news cycles with mushroom clouds, to make voters panic and write letters demanding their leaders to stay out of Ukraine. Because dictators know one thing: a nervous electorate is often more dangerous to Western governments than Russian tanks ever could be. They had seen this trick before. Stalin did not nuke the US during Korean. Khrushchev did not push the button over Vietnam. Even Kim Jong-un rattles his nukes weekly, and yet somehow the apocalypse never arrives. The real card was not the nukes, it was Kaliningrad itself. A wedge of Russian territory carved from old Prussia after World War II turned into a bristling missile zone sitting right on NATO's doorstep. And the heart of this power, once again, the Suwalki Gap. A 70-kilometer patch of land between Belarus and Kaliningrad, NATO's weakest link. If Russia seized it, the Baltic states, such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, could be cut off, strangled before reinforcements could even have a chance to arrive. War simulations predicted horrible things: up to 60,000 NATO soldiers potentially dead in a single day, whole armies shredded before the world could even process the news. And in the world of smartphones and live streams, that kind of massacre would not be hidden like Verdun or Stalingrad. It will spread fast, like a wildfire. It would explode on every screen. That was the gamble Moscow made. NATO might technically be stronger, but NATO voters would not stomach rivers of blood for tiny Baltic nations even they could not find on the map. That is the trick Kaliningrad played for decades, making NATO hesitate. It's not the weapon that scares people, it is being in its crosshairs. But since Kaliningrad has no land border with the rest of Russia and is surrounded by European countries, what do people who actually live there think about all this and them being used as pawns in the biggest game of political chess? Let's talk about them in our next chapter. For now, Kaliningrad fortress is not just facing NATO, it is facing its own people. You see, Moscow always liked to think of the region as the loyal outpost, a Russian island in a hostile sea. But reality is far messier. Its residents live closer to Berlin than to Moscow. They watch European TV, they travel to Poland for shopping trips, and their neighbors speak Polish and Lithuanian, not Russian propaganda slogans. Then came Ukraine. The war bled Russia dry, economically and militarily. And suddenly, the cracks in Kaliningrad's loyalty burst open. A group called themselves the Baltic Republican Party started making noise again, led by activists who see Europe as their natural home, not Putin's rusting empire. One of their leaders openly declared that the time for independence has come. And that's not the kind of talk you make lightly in Putin's Russia, unless you're prepared to risk prison or worse. And by the way, have you even heard about that group, the Baltic Republican Party? If no, well, I don't blame you, I haven't heard myself until recently, which exactly proves the point. The Russian propaganda tries its best not to shine light on these people and hide all traces of their activity online and elsewhere. So as you can see, the word doesn't spread outside that much. But here's the shocker for the Kremlin. People listened. A referendum covering 1/5 of Kaliningrad's population showed that 72% in favor of leaving Russia. That's nearly 70,000 people putting their names on the line for separation, in the middle of a war, knowing fully well that the Kremlin calls that treason, and then, jail sentences will follow. Still, they were not afraid. And if 70,000 were brave enough to vote, imagine how many more stayed silent, thinking exactly the same, just waiting for the right moment. Moscow, of course, responded the way it usually does, with arrests, censorship, and then branding distance as foreign agents. That's pretty much it. But the fear is not going away. The more coffins come back from Ukraine, the more economic hardship deepens, the stronger the separatist movement grows. Kaliningrad is no longer a fortress pointing outward. It is a powder keg simmering inward. And Putin, already stretched thin, cannot afford another fire he cannot put out. Speaking about NATO, it obviously considers Kaliningrad a huge threat to the alliance's security. But instead of fighting it like they do with Russia, they decide to try a different approach. Which one? Let's talk about it in our next chapter. If Kaliningrad was Russia's top card, NATO just ripped it out of the deck. How? With two words: Finland and Sweden. Before, the Baltic Sea was a dangerous chessboard. NATO convoys reinforcing the Baltics had to sail past Kaliningrad's missile nests, or through choke points Russia could saturate with artillery. Another way was obviously to squeeze through the Suwalki Gap, that 70 kilometers literal death funnel. Either way, NATO risked catastrophe. That is why Moscow's threats worked, because the geography made them possible. But then Putin's war backfired. Instead of scaring Europe, it pushed Finland and Sweden straight into the NATO's arms. Now the alliance stretches all around the Baltic Sea, and suddenly NATO does not have to send troops through Suwalki meat grinder anymore, because it can reinforce the Baltic from the north, by the sea, by air, with Finland's vast border and Sweden's naval power at its disposal. Kaliningrad, once the spider at the center of its own spiderweb, is now surrounded on all sides. Its so-called anti-access bubble is fully punctured. And Western think tanks already spell it out. Fortress Kaliningrad is no longer defensible. The French Institute of International Relations, for example, flatly declared that no amount of Russian effort could make the region hold against NATO now. The Baltic Fleet stationed there, useless, boxed in. Its only real mission being to defend Kaliningrad itself, a very expensive liability Moscow can barely afford. And here is the cruel irony now. By invading Ukraine, Putin forced NATO to expand. The very nightmare he claimed the invasion was meant to prevent is now a reality. Kaliningrad, instead of intimidating the West, has become the weakest Russian link, a pocket of territory Moscow must defend at a huge cost, cut off from the mainland, vulnerable to blockade, and sitting like bait for separatists inside. So what happens next then? That is the $1,000,000 question, or maybe even $1,000,000,000 liability question. Russia has already started pulling some military assets out of Kaliningrad, redeploying them to, you guess where, Ukrainian front lines. That's not strategy, that is literal desperation. If the Kremlin truly believed its own rhetoric, that NATO encirclement was the existential threat, then Kaliningrad would be sacred ground, untouchable, fortified to the teeth, with the best weapons, the best technology possible. Instead, Putin is cannibalizing it, stripping its own defenses to prop up a failing war. It's like pawning a family heirloom to just pay down your gambling debts. For Moscow, this is very dangerous math. Every day it holds Kaliningrad, it risks more separatist agitation, more supply problems, more NATO pressure. Every ruble spent defending it is a ruble not spent on Ukraine or on propping up Russia's collapsing economy. At some point, the Kremlin may quietly conclude that, well, it's just not worth the cost anymore. And if that day comes, then what? Kaliningrad could become independent, a Baltic Singapore or Taiwan or whatever you want to call it, on just Europe's doorstep. It could be absorbed by Poland or Lithuania as well. Or it could just linger as a Russian region in its name only, cut off, irrelevant, and just a shrinking relic of imperial dreams. Any option in one way or another is just humiliating, equally for Moscow. One thing though is already clear. Kaliningrad will never be again this kind of fortress that scared NATO into paralysis. That chapter is now closed. Putin has lost the psychological advantage, and with it, the ability to hold Europe hostage through geography alone. Even if Russia closes out some kind of victory in Ukraine, it has already lost the wider geopolitical war. The Kaliningrad card is burned, and its ashes spread across entire Europe. And the empire's sharpest sword has turned into a knife at its literal own throat. Kaliningrad is no longer the Kremlin's fortress, it's the Kremlin's trap. And once an empire starts losing pieces on the map, history shows that the rest tends to follow rather quickly. Kaliningrad, Chechnya, Siberia. But more about these specific regions in one of our next videos, so if you don't want to miss them, guys, please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. If you want to support our work, there are links down below, for example, Patreon memberships is the best way to support what we do here on YouTube. Thanks so much for watching, see you on Tuesday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe